Hello, and welcome to Third Eye Thinkers. I'm your host, Michelle Welch.
Hi, I'm your host, Megan Benanti. Thanks so much for joining us today. So today we have a really special guest. It's Mary Kay Greer. And if for any of you that are in the tarot community, you've probably already heard about her because she is definitely one of our forefathers in the tarot world. So we're really excited to have her join us. Hi, Mary. You guys can see her now. And I just want to tell you a little bit about her before we get into having Mary talk about her new book, which is Pamela Colman Smith, The Untold Story. And we're really excited about this book because Pamela Colman Smith was the creator of the Rider-Waite deck, all the artwork in that. And so it's really great to finally have a book out about that, and we can find out more about her. So to tell you a little about Mary, she started her introduction in the 1960s and with the tarot, and initially with the show Dark Shadows. And they used tarot cards as part of the plot, and that really intrigued her. And so when she was in college, one of her friends received a book by Eden Gray, who is also where I started was with Eden Gray. And Mary was really, really intrigued with that. And so when she was in college, she went to a metaphysical bookstore in Tampa, Florida, and she went on this spiritual quest to find her first deck. And so from there, she discovered a Rider-Waite deck, and then she also just discovered the whole occult world and the metaphysical world and was able to really take off with that. And she was really drawn to the idea that these images could reveal something about yourself and tell stories and really develop not only your own personal experience, but someone else's experience. And so she really began to pursue this as her life direction and made this a passion. And so she has literally been teaching tarot and traveling around the world and doing an internet blog and publishing books since then. And we are so honored to have her here with us today to talk about this new book. So Mary, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm honored, and that was quite an introduction.
Well, we're so glad you could come on board. I was really excited about this book, and I got mine a few weeks ago in the mail. It is available on Amazon, and it's Pamela Colman Smith, The Untold Story. And Mary's one of the co-authors on that with Stuart Kaplan and Elizabeth Foley O'Connor and Melinda Boyd Parsons. So, Mary, what got you started on this journey with Pamela Colman Smith?
It was writing Women of the Golden Dawn, which was about 4 other women who were members of the Golden Dawn. At the time, I couldn't find a lot of information on Pamela Colman Smith, and then I discovered Melinda Boyd Parsons, who was doing an in-depth biography. So I sort of put aside the biography part, but still stayed intrigued and open to any mention of what work she was doing. So I followed Melinda's biographical material through the years and kept up with it. And then I stumbled on newspapers.com and discovered a huge number of articles about Pamela Colman Smith. So that re-intrigued me because there was all this detail about her life. Around that time, Stuart Kaplan decided that he wanted to put together his collection of art and other materials about Pamela Colman Smith, and asked Melinda and me and Elizabeth, who is an English literature professor, and had been writing on Pamela Colman Smith. So he asked us all to do it together. But it was just having contact with information about her makes all the difference in the world.
Oh, well, I love that. And I want to ask you, if you don't mind explaining a little bit, because some of our listeners might actually be new to the tarot. And you guys have to understand, Mary is like a true historian, and she knows everything about this. She has over almost 2,000 tarot decks and almost as many books on the tarot. Would you mind explaining a little bit about what the Golden Dawn is?
The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was a ceremonial magic organization founded in 1888 by 3 Rosicrucian Masons, and they wanted to do practical magic and explore things that aren't part of the regular Masonic or Rosicrucian kinds of ideas of spiritual thinking. They wanted actual practice. So it was the first magical organization to have men and women working together as equals. Pamela Coleman Smith joined it around 1900, right around then, and it was at the time that the Golden Dawn, the original group that was formed in 1888, was breaking up. But there was a section that was done by Waite, and so she joined that part. She didn't advance very far, but when Waite decided to do a deck, he went to her because of her great artistic ability.
Wow, that's
Yes.
really great.
What's interesting to me, I found, and I believe this is in your book. Someone was reviewing your book, and they're all phenomenal reviews. Everything that I have read has just been just glowing reports about the book. And it said that Arthur Edward Waite commissioned Pamela Coleman Smith and to design this rider. And let me first ask you this. Everybody says the rider Waite, and a lot of times they leave off Smith. Is that part of what your book is about? How she tends to get left off as, the illustrator, and there's such an impact on this deck?
Well, feminists ever since the 70s have been saying, where's her name? Why isn't it on there more prominently? And she's been acknowledged on the deck. Originally, it was just called Tarot Cards, that when Ryder first published it. And Ryder was the initial publisher. Ryder was later bought out by Random House, and then Stuart Kaplan got the rights to produce it. And at that point, he called it the Rider Waite deck rather than just generally tarot cards. So it's only recently that he decided to make a deck that was specifically had her name on it as part of the title, and not just a comment on the side of the box.
Yeah.
Well, it said that Waite was supposedly said that she was a most imaginative and abnormally psychic artist. It seems also to me that she was very much, from reading your book, and I've not read it cover to cover, but I've read parts of the book. It's something that I love studying, and it's such a book to study. But she seems that she was so ahead of her time in so many ways. Could you share some of those with us?
Well, she was an artist in a time when women were, it was felt that their husbands, their fathers, their brothers would take care of them. So in Victorian England, so women didn't need to work. So they were often offered not very much money for whatever they did do, and weren't often selected as the artists for important works because a man who was supporting a family needed the job. Of course, she lived on her own. Her father died when she was relatively young, her mother and father, and so she was on her own and needed the money. She had to fight for it all the time. So a lot of the letters from her are about how she wasn't getting paid and how she was having to go back again and again to try and get her rights. She also wasn't hired to do a lot of work that she might have had the opportunity to do because the work needed to go to a man. So that was one of her big fights. And just to be acknowledged in the world. Plus her feminist leaning, she was very active in the women's suffrage movement in England. She was American, but she lived the majority of her life in England. So there's probably a lot more, just her independent spirit. She worked in the theater, but always backstage. She did costume designs and occasionally set design.
Well, and I was fascinated reading the book. This book, by the way, is really, really beautiful. And there's lots of images. So to me, this is also a coffee table book. So don't be afraid to leave it out on your counter, because it's one of those books that people will pick up because people are interested in art. And I feel there was a lot of images in there that I was really drawn to. both with her early work and her later works, because you can really see how her skill as an artist evolved over time. Um, but her younger work, or the work that she did when she was younger, to me is really interesting because it's got this sort of um, um, it's not always pretty. And I think that people expected women to make pretty paintings and pretty art. And I feel like she really captured personalities with some of the distortions that she made in faces and that kind of thing. And she was a very intriguing looking woman herself. It said in here that they called her Pixie as her nickname. And she really was kind of that firecracker personality. And, you know, I couldn't help but notice as I read the book some of the struggles of this social injustice that she was dealing with, and that were not only at that time, but gosh, I mean, it just felt like I was reading it in today's society. And I was wondering kind of what your thoughts on are about that.
Well, she did start to her own printing company. It didn't go very far. It was very limited in what she was able to do, but that was another way in which she tried to put her own work out the way she wanted it. Some people really loved her work, but they called it primitive. Other people didn't like it because the colors were too bright. And at the time, it was kind of popular to have the more muted colors, whereas hers were just in your face, bright, childlike, fanciful. And so I think the fact that she couldn't be put in any particular category was one of the major problems for people who didn't know what to do with her, where to place her. She, though, never gave up on doing things her own way. Besides being a publisher, a set and costume designer, an artist for book publications, she also was a storyteller professionally. And she had lived in Jamaica from the time she was 10 until off and on her early, around 20. And during that time, she became intrigued by the stories that they told of a figure called Anansi, a kind of half spider, half figure, half human figure, very similar to the Brer Rabbit stories. And so she would dress up in Jamaican clothing and use their accent and tell stories, these Jamaican stories, as a profession. So she made her way in very unusual, very idiosyncratic kinds of ways that always was an expression of her own beliefs, her own artistic sensibility. As a matter of fact, her teachers, when she attended the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York, for a couple of years, on and off, her teachers said, "There's nothing we can teach her." I don't know if it was an exasperation or what, but they did publish a lot of her work and wrote articles about her, so they did find her one of the most intriguing of students.
Wow, that is really cool. And, you know, in your own personal journey, do you feel like you've paralleled some of that? That sense of independence and having to cut your own path through all this?
I don't think I have more than most people,
Okay.
who came of age in the late 60s, 70s, and since then. So not especially, but I have read and studied a lot about women and the journey to, suffrage, the women's liberation. I was a college professor for quite a few years and head of a women's studies program. So she certainly is one of my models, one of my kind of psychological mentors in her going her own path, making her way in the world when other people couldn't. But I don't see me as being any different than most of us in having to step out and really stand up for ourselves.
I
Well,
see you as foraging ahead,
I
definitely.
see a lot of that, and you, as many of us look up to you. So I would say yes, you have done that in many ways. It's interesting because I was looking at something that you had written when you were interviewed a while back about your book Tarot for Yourself, and I want to read a little something to you. You said you spoke about tarot taboos, such as the one about not reading for oneself. You said, quote, "My philosophy was that taboos are what the word originally meant, which is sacred. So I started to look at the taboos that way and said, what if these are sacred, holy things, but that we just need to be careful how we do them? So I just broke every rule I could find, and I recommended that in the book. This sounds to me a lot like some of the things, maybe, with Pamela Coleman Smith. She didn't follow all the norms. And by all accounts, she didn't fit into all the norms. What rules won't you break regarding tarot?" And I do say that would be that you are a trailblazer, and you have done so much for this community. So,
Well, I have probably broken almost all the rules and then set ones for myself that are not absolute. There's always a situation where I might possibly break them. And I do that based on my own intuition in the moment, what's going on in that moment. So, but in order to find what really works and what doesn't, you have to experiment. So even the rules or the kind of habits, the things that I find myself doing over and over again, occasionally I'll deliberately break them just to shake myself up, shake up the situation, and see if there's another path that I might want to tread a little more.
and it's great how you've led us all with you on that journey through your 10 books, this being the 10th book. And I will say this, with your books, I have a lot of them on Kindle. Then I have the hard copy because I want to highlight. I'm a notorious highlighter. And I will say, even for this book, it's so beautiful that I have two, because one has to be that one that you keep in pristine condition. And then one has to be the one where you want to highlight the interesting things that you want to learn about the book. It's just fabulous.
And I can attest to Michelle and her highlighting. She has highlighters like all over her purse. I've never seen anything like it.
Well, especially when I'm learning from people, you know, and then want to highlight all the great things they have to say. So, yeah.
Another thing you can do is what I call taking notes in tarot teas, which many of my books have along the borders of the side of the book or at the very top of a page, the tarot cards that I associate with a particular thing, especially all my psychology books, anthropology, social issues books. I'm always finding situations that, to me, accord or perfect examples of a particular tarot card. And so I write that card in the margin.
Oh, I love that.
I really love that.
Yes.
That's a great way to really connect with a card and make it so much deeper in personal meaning. That's awesome.
And you also, it helps you to find things that connect that you might not have associated together if you hadn't done that. So if you have a whole bunch of emperor notes, you can start connecting things between books in your own individual way.
Wow, that's awesome.
You know, I know that it seems to me that you are very, very educated on the archetypes and, you know, studying Carl Jung and know so much about those. I was reading something recently and I wanted your opinion on this. And I think it was Carolyn Myss, M-Y-S-S. I mispronounced
Carolyn
her name.
Myss.
Thank you, Mace. Thank you for that, for correcting me on that. And I apologize for getting that wrong. But I read something that she wrote recently where she feels like there may be some more, and I don't want to misquote her, but the way I understood it, that the archetypes may be changing or being added to or tweaked just a little bit. How do you feel about that?
The core idea of the archetypes is that they are first types. They're, in our DNA. They're at an instinctual level. So the core of them, the source of them, doesn't really change, at least is the way I understand it. But what we perceive, what we generally call archetypes out in the world, are actually archetypal images. And those are constantly evolving and changing. If you track them back, though, they tend to track back to these more mythic and instinctual level concepts that are really rooted in our biology. So, yes, the surface level of it is constantly evolving and changing, what they call the archetypal images. And it's important to understand there's a difference between the archetypes, which are the roots, and the archetypal images, which are the more specific manifestations out in the world.
Oh, wow.
Thank you for explaining that. Yeah, that makes sense
awesome.
to me. And I'm sure that's what I probably misquoted Carolyn Mace on that too. I'm sure she agrees with you on that. But it was interesting to me because she had a book that I was reading about that. And it's, I agree that those images do change. So thank you for explaining that difference.
Yeah, well, we talk about the tarot archetypes, and they're really archetypal images. It's just a shortcut to kind of say, oh, I'm connecting with the tarot archetypes. But really, the tarot are the more specific archetypal images that point back to deeper roots.
Okay. No, that all makes good sense. I want to jump back to the book for a minute
Yes.
because I had a question about that. What's been your favorite part in this journey? I didn't want you to have to give away any of the book, so I kind of geared my questions about your process with this book. When you were writing Pamela Coleman Smith, The Untold Story, what was the best part of it for you?
Probably the number one best part of it was sharing the information with the other people that were working on the book. The fact that each of us was coming up and discovering new things. And so the fact that we could share that information and ideas with each other was really important to me. It's so often as a writer, you're on your individual journey, and you may get a reader, and they like your work. Usually they're mostly very enthusiastic about what you're doing, with a few comments here and there. But when you're working with a group who are all deeply involved in the subject, then there is this sharing with people that nobody else has gone that deep.
Right.
So they understand. The other part that was really exciting for me, besides finding the materials, was making the connection with Cornwall, where she lived for the last 30 years of her life, about which we have practically no information. So I've got some stories about that. And most of that happened just after the book went to press. So that's kind of the add-on. And it's interesting that there is still these add-on pieces that we keep getting.
Oh, so it sounds like there'll be another book eventually, too. That's pretty exciting.
I think this would
They're
make a
all
great
little
movie.
tiny bits and pieces.
Yes, I think
Pardon?
this would be a great movie. Have you guys explored that idea? A screenplay, maybe?
Getting something made into a movie is very difficult.
Yeah, it's
I
true.
had somebody who wanted to do a movie with Women of the Golden Dawn, and that ended up not going very far. I discovered it's far more complex than you would think.
I can
Gotcha.
imagine, but I think it would be a good movie.
I think, the storyline would be fascinating. So,
Yes. One thing you talked about in the book was that Pamela Coleman Smith had, and I'll see if I can pronounce it right, synesthesia. Could you explain a little
Yes.
bit about that?
Synesthesia is the crossover between two or more senses. So some people smell names. So every time they hear a name, there's a particular smell that comes with it automatically for them. Other people see numbers as colors, and they can pick out particular numbers that are laid out in a specific pattern, like a triangle or a square, from a mass of other numbers, because they can see that color forming a square. There's tests online that you can do for that one that I discovered I've got none of that ability, because I could never see the geometric pattern. But Pamela Coleman Smith saw music, And that means that she would go to listen to music being played live and, whenever possible, by the composer themselves. And as she would listen, she would start drawing what she saw in her mind's eye. And if she tried to change any piece of it, it was like the iris on a camera that would just snap shut. So she had to stay open to whatever image was coming through to her and not change anything, which to me, in terms of being psychic, is one of the best trainings possible, to not bring any of your own material into it. So that kind of tied in with the fact that she was also very psychic, highly psychic. But she did this with music, and also a very interesting thing is that she would take her paintings that she did from her sketches, she would take them to different musicians and ask them to play music that they thought went along with her picture. And she found that in most cases, the music they played was very similar to each other's.
Oh, wow.
That's fascinating.
That is really cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yes.
So, I wanted to look at one last thing, too, before we kind of begin to wrap up today. For our listeners, if you were to give them a thought to take away from this, or a task, or an idea, what would you want to gift them with?
Wow. I hate these questions.
Oh, sorry. I know I had to throw a toughie.
It's a good question. I think that what we can come with from Pamela Coleman Smith with is the importance of going with what our greatest love is, to really develop our own skills and styles of doing things. If you're a tarot reader, you don't have to read the cards like anyone else. What is it that you enjoy most about the reading process? What are you best at? If you could eliminate all the techniques of tarot reading that you don't like and just, don't work for you, then what does your reading look like? That doesn't mean that you don't experiment later on, or try out things later, because maybe they will work for you at a later point. But just that idea of what happens if you do what you do best, what you love best. And I think that's what we get from Pamela Coleman Smith.
Wow, that was beautifully said.
That is beautifully said.
I tell you, Mary, every time I listen to you, it deepens how I experience the tarot. And Mary's been a really personal mentor to me over the years, and I've grown exponentially through, I had her books before I even knew who she was. And I was like, oh, I've got that book, and then I ended up sitting at the table next to her and not even realizing it. So
yeah, I remember you telling me that.
Yeah.
How you were so excited when you were at your first reader studio.
Yep.
And you sat down and you just...
Yeah, I was sitting at a table with Mary Greer and sitting next to Rachel Pollack, and Farrell Humphrey came up and she's like, how did you get to sit here? And I was like, I have no idea. Why? Who are these people?
But we also taught a workshop together.
Yes.
Megan, you and I.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.
And that all came from Mary's teachings, and definitely was like, she truly changed and saved my life. So because I went through my whole cancer process doing the work that I had learned from Mary at the reader studio. So that was really, really cool. And I have a whole visual journal of readings that I drew pictures of that I learned from Mary. And that was really, really cool. So, and it
you took it far beyond what I had ever even conceptualized.
Well, it was just because I liked it. I liked the way you spoke to me, and I really got you, and I felt like you were teaching something I really wanted to embrace. And so, even just listening to you today, my jaw just drops. So you have that kind of impact on me.
Yes.
So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think she has that impact on a lot of people.
Yeah.
But thank you for sharing that because that's beautiful. And I know that we'll be seeing you soon. Megan and I. Are you going to be, Mary, in Portland? Aren't you speaking in Portland?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
and
at the Northwest Tarot Symposium.
I am persuading Megan to come to that with me. And
Yep.
then will you be at the Reader Studio this year also? Will you be attending?
Probably.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like it.
Awesome. So we'll see you there too.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Mary, where, if people want to start following you, what is the best way for them to stay connected with you?
Two ways. One is my blog, which is my major presence on the web, and Facebook. The blog is marykgreer.com, and Facebook, you can just look me up on there, Mary K. Greer. Also, I'm at globalspiritualstudies.com, where there's a lot of my workshops that have been turned into webinars.
Great.
So any one of those three ways, Facebook, my blog, or you can just Google Greer Tarot blog, and you'll find me.
Oh, perfect.
And
So,
Global Spiritual Studies.
okay, awesome. Well, and you guys feel free, all our listeners, to go ahead and tap into Mary. And definitely her blog is full of information and ways to read cards. And it's beautifully done.
Yes,
Yeah.
I just read A New Way, and I don't know what you called it, but there's a New Way. You posted it. It was maybe 3 or 4 blogs ago, and it's a brand new way. And I'm like, I am going to start practicing that. It sounds so amazing. It's a pyramid. Do you know what I'm talking about, Mary?
Yeah.
With the major arcana.
Yes, the
Yeah.
majors. Yes. So I can't wait to do that one. So when you go on, you guys, when you go on this blog, you're learning from the master. You're learning from the one and who is our trailblazer, really. Seriously, Mary, now. And at my store in Soultopia, we're telling everyone about you. We have your books. And right now, Megan texted me before we came on the air, and she said, do you have our books in Soultopia? And I was like, we do. It's time to order more because every time someone comes in, we sell your books. So, and we're getting this one. It's interesting because I ordered it when I was at INATS, and for some reason our order hasn't come in, so I need to check on that. But now I'll be able to tell them so much more about it. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mary, so much for coming on.
And it looks like our time is wrapping up. So I'm just going to say you've been listening to Third Eye Thinkers with Michelle Welch and Megan Benanti. If you enjoyed our show today, please give us a 5-star, 5-star review and subscribe to Third Eye Thinkers on any of the podcast networks and on YouTube. We are produced by Real News Communications Network with a special thanks to Matt Stoker, Zach Lewis, and Anna Xavier as our producers and for each and every show, and our social media assistant, Cassie Clayton. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Keep third eye thinking.
Thank you. Yeah. It was
Thank you,
great
Mary.
being on.
Mary, you still there?
Mary?